Are you thinking about switching over to an EV but don't quite know what to expect? Don't worry, in this video I'll be sharing my own experience as comprehensively as I can, and I'll be covering the good and the bad. Watch though, it might accelerate your plans to get one. Hi, I'm Gary and welcome back to my channel, Gary Does Solar. Now, regular viewers to this channel will know that I cover all things solar and also technologies that are related to that. Many people who get solar installed onto their property often go on to get an EV. And many people with an EV often get solar installed onto their property in time, not least because the power generated by the solar can be used to charge the EV. I've been wanting to cover EV topics on my channel for some time, but I couldn't start any of that until I'd actually had personal experience of one. Well, over the last few months I've gained a lot of experience, and in this video I want to share with you everything I've learned, so that if you're thinking about changing from an internal combustion engine or ICE vehicle to an electric one, but you're not sure how to go about it, or indeed what to expect, you can get answers in the next 20 minutes or so. Now, as I live in the UK, this video will of course have a UK slant, but actually most of the points I make are applicable to EVs all over the world, so it's still well worth watching. Okay, let's get started. So, where to begin? Just over a year ago, I had such high hopes that I'd be getting an EV before long that I asked my solar installer to fit an EV charger at the same time. It was certainly embarrassing having an EV charger installed on my driveway for an entire year without having any EVs to use it. And so I was glad when Tim and Kat visited from Tim and Kat's Green Walk YouTube channel, and they were able to test it for me to make sure it actually worked. So although my wife Sarah and I wanted to change from an internal combustion engine car to an EV, we figured out that simply going ahead and buying a particular EV, even from a well-known brand, without having any experience at all about the technology, was a bit of a financial risk. And this is probably a good time to point out there are actually 3 types of electric vehicle, and each have their own benefits and drawbacks. The first is hybrid electric vehicle, or HEV. HEVs are the most common type of hybrid, and they've been around the longest too. They have 2 power sources, a fuel-based internal combustion engine and a separate electric motor powered by a battery. When the car sets off, it's initially powered by electricity, but when a certain speed is reached, the fuel internal combustion engine takes over. A clever aspect is that the battery is constantly recharged through what is called regenerative braking, something we'll talk more about later. The Toyota Prius is probably the most famous HEV. Then there is a variant of that called plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, or PHEV. Like HEVs, PHEVs also have 2 power sources, an internal combustion engine, but also a motor and battery. The battery is much larger, however, allowing the car to be driven on battery power alone for maybe 20 or 30 miles. More than that, the battery can be recharged by plugging in the car via an external outlet, such as a public charging point or even at home. Some notable examples of PHEVs are the Toyota Corolla and the Volvo XC40. Finally, there are battery electric vehicles, or BEVs. Now, BEVs are powered entirely by electricity. There's no internal combustion engine, no fuel tank and no exhaust pipe. In fact, there's no gearbox and no clutch either. Instead, it has 1 or more electric motors powered by a fairly large battery. And just like PHEVs, the battery is charged via an external outlet. There are plenty of videos on YouTube that discuss the relative merits of each, but the one my wife and I were interested in was the last type, battery electric vehicle. And for ease, I'll use the term EV to mean this type for the remainder of the video. So we wanted to try out a few EVs first before buying one, but how do you go about doing that? Well, in March this year, we came across a local news article about an EV car club scheme in Oxfordshire, not too far away from where we live. We thought if we signed up to this scheme, we could try out a few different EVs over the next few weeks in order to build up some experience of driving EVs in general, and also what particular cars were like to drive before we made any buying decisions. Of the 3 companies that were taking part in the scheme at the time, we chose Co-Wheels. Now, as it turned out, the EVs that Co-Wheels had on offer all seemed to be from the same manufacturer. I guess they bulk leased them. And that was fine with Sarah and I, as we had 0 EV experience at all, and we had to start somewhere. We first hired this MG4 for a couple of days, and just drove it around Oxford and the neighbouring towns and villages, using windy country roads as well as fast dual carriageways. A couple of weeks later we hired this MG5, but this time we drove it into London for the Everything Electric show that was taking place. I'll talk about the experiences with all the cars we tried shortly. Then, about 2 months ago, my wife and I were planning a trip to Scotland to see my family there and also go to the Lake District to do some hiking, and then another trip up to Durham for our daughter's graduation. We were planning to take our trusty old Audi A4 Avant, but the clutch suddenly packed in and there was no way it was going to get fixed in time. So although it was extra cost, it was actually the perfect opportunity to hire an EV for a month or so and see what the long distance driving with an EV was like. I went to the Hertz website and checked what EVs they had available nearby, and there was only one available for the length of time we required, and it was a Polestar 2 at Oxford Airport. So I booked it and off we went. There's actually quite a lot to share with you about our experiences, so I'll break it down into separate topics. Let's start with the general EV driving experience. I mean, wow, it was just so good. I always thought that the idea of a human having to manually control gears in a car was ridiculous. And of course that's why automatic cars were invented. But I was never able to persuade Sarah to get an automatic car. And actually, it's only after you've driven an EV that you realise how inferior automatic cars are anyway. With an EV, you have precise control over the speed and acceleration of the car at all times, whatever speed you're doing. It's hard to describe that without experiencing it for yourself. From a standstill, you can accurately control how much the car crawls along with just a very light touch to the accelerator. And to speed up, you simply apply more pressure, as much or as little as you like. Here's the thing about having no gears. In an ICE car, as you speed up, you either have to change gear manually, or in an automatic car, that gear change will happen for you. But either way, everyone in the car will feel that gear change. This is especially noticeable if you want to overtake a vehicle on a single carriageway when you have limited time to do so. You'll need to drop a gear or two in order to do that. And even if your car is an automatic car, your passengers will feel that jolt as that happens. But in an EV, there's no jolt at all. Everything is super smooth. And if you want to overtake that same vehicle, you just accelerate the car and it will effortlessly and smoothly speed past it. Because the driving experience is so smooth, it actually influences how you drive. And I found that I ended up driving much calmer as a result. I didn't expect that at all. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit more about regenerative braking. It's such a cool technology. In an ICE car, driving around town involves frequent acceleration and deceleration, whether at traffic lights, turning onto new roads, or dealing with congestion. Every time you slow down, the vehicle's kinetic or moving energy is simply wasted. Regenerative braking changes this by using the electric motor to slow down the vehicle instead of relying solely on physical brake discs. This process converts the vehicle's kinetic energy back into electricity, which is then stored in the battery rather than being lost as heat to the atmosphere. And on the newer EVs, there's a feature called one-pedal driving, where when you lift your foot off the accelerator, the car doesn't coast along, but starts regenerative braking to a level that you're comfortable with. You might find yourself never having to use the brake pedal at all, except in emergencies. Not only is regenerative braking more efficient, but it's yet another reason why you might end up driving in a more calm way with no stress. The other thing that struck my wife and I almost immediately is an appreciation of just how clean and environmentally friendly an EV is. Our diesel Audi would spew out unpleasant exhaust when it started up, especially on cold days. We actually always had to make sure the door of the house was closed before starting it up because of that. And of course, that toxic exhaust, and there's no other word for it, is being continually released into the atmosphere all the time we're driving it. And that means when you're stuck in traffic, you're breathing it in. And when you're driving past schools at pick-up time, kids are breathing it in too. Contrast that with the EVs we drove. There were no emissions at all. And driving one made us realise how polluted the air is from millions of internal combustion vehicles on the road, especially in built-up areas. If my wife and I had any doubts about switching over to an EV, it was this awakening more than anything else that convinced us to make the jump. Okay, yeah, we should probably talk about range and range anxiety. Now, I won't lie, when my wife and I tried out the MG4 and MG5 cars, we both had a fair amount of range anxiety. You see, with an ICE car like our Audi A4 being diesel, it had a range of over 500 miles. And now here we were in a car that had a range of only 200 miles. And actually, when we picked up the MG4 for the first time, the battery was only around 60% charged, so the range was even less. Then, when we started driving it, we could see the range counter dropping by 1 mile in what seemed like every few seconds. It was quite alarming, really. This was our first EV experience, and we'd literally only just started with the car, and yet we felt we'd have to charge it soon before we ran out of battery. So we attempted to find a public charger, but we had absolutely no idea where they might be. And when we eventually found one, we had no idea on how to use it. So as a very first experience of driving an EV, it was not good. And actually my wife was fast coming to the conclusion that EVs were never going to become mass market at this rate. Even I was having doubts, but surely the millions of people buying EVs all around the world were not stupid. So I wanted to understand what was going wrong, and I felt the only way to do that was to persevere. So we eventually got the MG4 back home, and I charged it overnight on our Zappy charger. The next day we set out again, but this time with 100% battery. A much better experience with no range anxiety at all. We were able to drive nearly 200 miles without visiting a public charger. And when we came home, we simply plugged it in again and it charged up overnight. We quickly realised that actually most of our driving was going to be like that. Very rarely would we be driving more than 100 miles away from home, and so we would never need to visit a public charging station. And spoiler alert, our long-range driving experience with the Polestar 2, where we did about 1,500 miles in total, we had no range anxiety at all, and I'll explain why shortly. And it's worth saying at this point that with an EV, I'll be very happy that I won't ever need to visit a petrol station again ever. I don't know about you, but I just don't like petrol stations. I get it that it only takes maybe 5 or 10 minutes to fill up, but you have to wear a plastic glove, otherwise your hand will smell of fuel for the rest of the day. And it's really painful seeing how much that fuel has actually cost you. Charging at home is way easier and cheaper. Let's talk a little more about that. So what do you need in order to charge your EV at home then? Well, actually the only thing you need is this cable, and I think every EV comes with one of these as standard. You plug one end into your car and the other end into any wall socket in your house. That's it. Now don't expect your car to just charge up in 2 or 3 hours. A UK wall socket can only deliver around 3 kilowatts of power. And so if your battery is 75 kilowatt hours, it will take a full 24 hours to fill it. But realistically, you'll only need to charge what your battery may have used for the journeys the car made that day, which might only require a few hours or at worst an overnight charge. A step up from that is a dedicated EV charger fitted to your wall, like my own one here, which is wired directly into the consumer unit of the property. In the UK, a wall-mounted EV charger can deliver 7 kilowatts on a single phase, and 22 kilowatts if you're lucky enough to have 3-phase. So with that, you should always be able to charge your battery back up to 100% overnight, no matter how many miles you've done that day. Let's have a look at the costs of charging your EV at home in the UK then. To provide a 300-mile range in a typical diesel car, assuming 50 miles per gallon, this would cost you around £40 at the garage forecourt. Let's say an EV with that kind of range had a battery size of 75 kilowatt hours. If electricity cost 22 pence per kilowatt hour, that's a total cost of £16.50, less than half the diesel cost. But this is assuming a standard electricity tariff. Octopus Energy in the UK offers dedicated tariffs for EV owners, and their Intelligent Octopus Go tariff provides an off-peak rate of only 7 pence per kilowatt hour. That reduces your EV charging cost down to only £5.25. That's an 85% reduction of the diesel cost, quite unbelievable really. By the way, if you have an EV and you're with another energy provider, I strongly recommend you switch to Octopus Energy. In fact, I recommend you switch to them anyway. They're by far the best and most innovative provider in the UK, and they score very highly on just about every metric, especially customer service. Even better, switch to them using my referral code here and we'll both get £50. My share of that goes directly into the channel so I can make more and more videos for you. Now here's the thing, as well as all that cheap electricity to charge your EV, if you also have solar panels on your property, you can put all your excess solar generation into your EV, essentially charging it for free if you wanted. So as you can see then, home charging is great, but we should now cover charging away from the home. Just how bad and how expensive is it? I have to say that public charging was way better than we had been told it would be. Before we tried public charging for ourselves, we were under the impression that there weren't many charging stations across the country, and certainly not where you needed them. And many of those charging stations didn't work. You had to queue all the time, it was expensive, you had to download an app for each brand of charging station, and it took an absolute age to charge your EV. Let's compare these perceptions then with our actual experience. And we'll start with availability. It certainly might have been the case a few years ago that there were not too many charging stations available, and the ones that were available were not in the places you needed them. But today in the UK there are charging stations all over the country. You only have to look at a service like ZapMap here to see how many there are. If I zoom in to near where we live, you can see that there are always plenty of options just a few miles from wherever we might be. Of course, not all charging stations are the same. Some are just a single charging point with a slow rate of charging, and others are large stations with perhaps 6, 8, 10 or more rapid charging points. Of course, these charging stations are not everywhere yet, but they do tend to be on or near major roads. We were quick to learn that if you're planning a long trip requiring 1 or 2 charging stops, then a little planning goes a long way to removing any range anxiety. We primarily used an app called Electroverse. The Electroverse app allowed us to identify charging stations with a large number of rapid charging points along our preferred route. The idea being that we would have to stop at some point anyway for a rest break, and the likelihood of at least one charging point being free when we arrived would be high. By taking this approach, we had very few problems during a whole month of travel across the country, even in the Lake District where we didn't expect there to be a lot of availability. For those of you who still have concerns about the state of the UK charging network, take a look at these stats from ZapMap released last month, which continually show growth across the network all across the country. It's also worth reading this report from Charge EV released just a few days ago, and this will hopefully give you confidence that today and going forward, public charging availability is already quite good and it's getting better all the time. Let's talk about the cost of public charging then. Yeah, it was expensive, especially if you wanted a rapid charger to cut down your waiting time. We were generally paying around 80 pence or more per kilowatt hour, which made it about the same cost as buying diesel or petrol. To me, it felt like those charging companies were shooting themselves in the foot, giving detractors a reason to say that running an EV was not at all cheaper than running an ICE car. I get it that installing rapid charging stations has an appreciable cost associated, but seriously, a 300 to 400% markup on the cost of electricity? I have noticed though that since our trip, some of the major charging companies have discounted their prices by 20% or more, although you may have to sign up to their app. This tells me that there are now a sufficient number of rapid charging stations out there for there to be a competitive market, and so I would expect prices to start and continue to fall over time. So what was our experience like at the charging station itself? I think when we first started using the public charging network, our experience was not good at all. I mean, I consider myself a reasonably intelligent guy, and surely getting a charging point to work with your car can't be that difficult. I mean, it's basically just plugging in a cable, right? Well, no, the first thing you have to do is persuade the charging point that you're authorized to charge there, which means you need a means to pay. The most obvious method for doing this, of course, would be tapping your contactless payment card and then plugging the cable in. Now, some of the latest charging points did allow this, which was great, but more often than not, you had to download a dedicated mobile app for the charging station, sign up for a new account, add your payment card, and then use the app to start the charging session. I can see it from the charging station brand's point of view. It's a great way to capture personal details and build a loyal customer base. But with a plethora of brands, from the customer's point of view, it just gets messy having to manage several charging apps. Luckily, Octopus Energy in the UK had a solution for us called Electroverse that I spoke about earlier. As well as telling us where all the charging stations were, how many charging points were free at each station, and also what charging speeds were supported, we could just rock up to a charging point and tap the Electroverse card that was sent in the post, and we could just start charging. What's even better is that we could link our Electroverse account to our home energy account so that the charging sessions would appear on our monthly energy bills. Now that's what I call forward thinking, and it's yet another reason to switch to Octopus. In terms of the time taken to charge with the Polestar 2, it didn't take too long at all, maybe 20 to 40 minutes depending on how much charge we needed. And if you think about it, when you're on the motorway and you stop at the services, you're generally there for at least half an hour anyway, longer if you stop for lunch, so it's great if you can charge your car during that time, and you don't lose any more time having to visit the fuel station on the way out. So all in all, it was actually a workable experience for us. And by the time we got to our second long journey up to Durham for my daughter's graduation, we hardly gave charging a second thought. It felt like just a natural part of the journey by then. Oh, and a quick shout out to Abdul, who recognised me in his taxi in Durham as he drove us all back to the hotel one evening. He said he really liked the videos and we had a great chat about all things solar. I think I'd like to end this video by saying a few words about the total cost of ownership with an EV. There's the cost of the EV itself. EVs have traditionally been more expensive to buy than internal combustion engine cars, but even today that's changing, especially in the used EV market. Many reports now show price parity between EVs and ICE cars. But that's only part of the story. When you look at the running costs of an EV, that's where the real savings are. And over time, those savings are enormous. If you have an ICE car, spend a few moments calculating just how much you spent on fuel over the last 5 years, say. Now imagine only having to spend, say, 20% of that amount over the next 5 years. That level of saving will be different for everyone, of course, but for many it will be a sizable percentage of the cost of the EV itself. You can repeat that exercise for servicing and maintenance costs, especially if, like us, you normally buy used vehicles. Remember, in an EV there's no internal combustion engine, no fuel tank, no gearbox, no clutch, no exhaust pipe, and no catalytic converter. Basically, all the things where you generally get problems resulting in expensive fixes just don't exist in an EV. And that means there's very little in the way of servicing required either, brakes and tyres mainly. And with regenerative braking, you'll probably never need to change your brake discs either. All these kinds of cost savings, together with all the other benefits of owning an EV that I mentioned earlier, represent a real game changer to the automotive industry. I totally get why EV sales as a percentage of overall car sales is increasing every year across the world. And I hope that by sharing the experiences my wife and I had with EVs is useful to you if you are thinking about getting one. Please don't forget to like this video if so, and subscribe so you don't miss all the videos I'm working on. And as always, thanks for watching.